tell them that we're here.
Just started it. So we are now live. Kristen, I will say a few words of introduction here in a minute.
Okay.
As people get ready to log on. Welcome, everybody. It's great to see everyone this morning. We'll go ahead and get started. I have a few words of introduction, and then I'll introduce our next speaker here as people are logging in. So again, welcome to the last session of our conference. We've had a great week. As we said before, our theme this year has been navigating the past, present, and future. And we've had a great group of people and a variety of presentations that have really reflected what museums and archives are doing right now to help us reach out to the audiences and reach out and educate about the future. So my name again is Amanda Langendorfer. I'm the Associate Dean of Libraries for Special Collections and Museums at Truman State University, also serving as the current Vice President to the MAMA Board, and I'm pleased to be the moderator for today's session. So as we began, this conference would not have been possible without the support of the Missouri Humanities Council, and I would like to thank them for their continued funding and support of our organization. I'd also like to thank our president, Sarah Wilson, and our treasurer, Linda Endersby, as well as our conference planning committee. They worked really hard to put all of this together this past week, and I hope everyone has enjoyed themselves. And now for our last session, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Christian Swain. Kristen is the Associate Professor of American Art and the Director of Graduate Studies in Art History for the School of Visual Studies at the University of Missouri. Kristen, I believe you're here to tell us about some great collaborations and some great collections that you've been working with. So welcome.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for being here. I'm going to admit from the outset that I wrote my presentation, but I'm just going to present it more, how should I put this? I'm going to speak it because in many ways you all are much more the experts in what I'm talking about. And my goal in presenting this is really to get some feedback on how to make something possible. So it's a little bit of a story. It's a little bit of a teaching biography. It's a little bit glorifying in my students' work and in archival research and how we bring that forward and how we teach visual literacy. So it's something I think that it's at the heart of so many of our missions. And the question becomes, how can we do it and how can we get it out? And this is a project that's much bigger than me. It needs to be bigger than me. And I've learned that because I still can't get a website started. So it's been about 10 years. So hopefully I can get some good advice from you. I've titled the talk, The Missouri Heart of the Nation Art Collection is Artifact, Archive, and Living Laboratory. And as I think it will become clear, this collection of paintings is really extraordinary. And it provides this great opportunity to really talk about the history of Missouri and to bring people into the conversation and to have content that comes from a lot of different places to create a number of ways to interpret that. And I think just as to make us all co-creators. And in doing that, I think we also can learn a lot about how to look, how to see, and hopefully how to become better citizens, I think, of the state. So I'm thinking too quickly in my mouth. I'm speaking too quickly and my head is moving even faster. So why don't we get started? For those of you who don't know, the Missouri, okay. Why is that not working? Oh, the Missouri Heart of the Nation collection was commissioned in 1948 by the was commissioned by, okay, I'm sorry, I'm a little overwhelmed this morning. And now I'm trying to remember my text rather than just talking. So the Missouri Heart of the Nation collection is a series of 99 paintings and drawings that were done by some of the major, most important mid-century artists working in the United States. It was commissioned by the Scruggs Vanderbilt Barney department store, particularly its president, who saw this collection as a way to continue and to promote promote the department store and his goals for it. Scruggs Vanderbilt Barney was what we would call the last of the grand emporiums, a place where everyone would go to see and be seen, and they were tastemakers and pillars of the community. So this collection was sort of the perfect opportunity for him to continue that legacy. And when he began, he was really hoping the collection would showcase kind of the diversity of Missouri. And it was that aim which led these 14 different artists to go across the state to depict the highlights of Missouri, its folk cultures, its industrial triumphs, its scenes of everyday life. And it resulted in this catalog, which you can get on Amazon, I learned today, for about $900, but on eBay for about $18. So you might want to check it out. It resulted in this catalog, but it also became central to the advertising mission of the department store. I'm showing you here two different ads from 1948. The one on the left shows includes a painting from the collection, A Fine Day in Missouri by Adolph Den. And on the right, it includes a piece called The Mississippi at Hannibal, which you're going to see later today. It actually depicts Lover's Leap. So there's something interesting in having a fashion plate standing right next to the site in which lovers have jumped to their death, according to legend. And it ended up, it toured Missouri. It toured the entire state for over 2 years, and it ended up at the University of Missouri, particularly because of the efforts of Ellis, who was at the time the Dean of Arts and Science. And we can see him here along with Fred Shane unpacking some of the paintings. And the paintings ended up in Jesse Hall until about 2014, when Jesse Hall underwent renovations and it was transferred to the University of Missouri Museum of Art and Archaeology. Now, when granting the request or when gifting it, I want to quote from the Missouri alumnus. Mayfield said, "We hope that Missouri Heart of the Nation will be a nucleus around which the University of Missouri may build, with the aid of its generous citizens and organizations, a truly representative art collection, which it has long needed." I'm just making a point there. And Ellis had said, I think correctly, that what better place to put the collection but in a central location where people from around the state could visit it and where all those members were coming to this land grant university. I'm showing you one of the few photographs of the collection in Jesse Hall. It turns out not many people took photographs of it in situ, and that's not quite surprising because it ended up, as many of you know, it was sort of this wonderful place to look, but the collection was rather haphazardly kept and maintained. Um, but as I'll tell you about later, there were many people who came specifically to find the people in the paintings later on. So here are 4 examples of paintings from the collection. And you can see that they range from expressionistic to realistic. They cover traditions um, of basket making, the Veiled Prophet Parade. And in many ways, they were presented as folk and authentic images, almost documentary images of American life. And the style, the sort of representational regionalist style, only enhanced that sense that these were kind of snapshots and somehow not interpretations. So in 2011, I taught my first class using this collection, and the goal was twofold. And one was to get students to work with original artifacts. And these paintings were in Jesse Hall at the time, so they could go and look at them every day. And secondly, I really liked the idea of teaching them to think about how they access information in a digital platform. Most of them were doing their research by now online, and to make them sort of visually literate, to understand how information is presented to them, how the context of that presentation can change its meaning. All of those things I thought we could deal with if we thought about how do we take our research and make it public. It also requires learning to write for different audiences and in different contexts. The first class, however, as much as I wanted them to get involved in the individual pictures, I also realized we needed to get a handle on the entire thing, because the collection is pretty massive. It's it's about 100 pieces by 14 different male artists working, who were very prominent at the time. And as we did that, we learned sort of 3, and for those of you who are interested, on Tuesdays, what we did is we took sort of a bird's eye view of the collection, and we'd look at art in the 1940s, essentially. And then on Tuesday, we would look at it from the ground level. Students did kind of archival reports. They of different varieties. One student, for example, just looked at every time Missouri was mentioned in Life magazine, for example. So they began to do these presentations from the archives. And as we did this, we came up with three, I think, important observations. The first was that as scholars have shown, and as we can see when looking back at the visual culture of the period, fine art was part and parcel with mass culture in this time, right? That art was not restricted to the museums. It was not restricted to galleries, and it was not restricted to the elite. Indeed, much work had been done in the 1930s and 40s to expand the patronage base for the fine arts. So one thing is, we knew that the people who were looking then at these photographs had seen similar kinds of images, and they were surrounded by them in post offices, in, as I said, in advertisements, in calendars, in art education materials. The second thing we learned, which was really important, is that although there was a rhetoric of regionalism that surrounded these paintings, the fact is most of the artists chose scenes that were well known nationally and that had already been pictured. So for example, here's Fine's image of corn cobbing. On the right, we see a similar photograph from an article in Life magazine in 1945. On the far left, we have a painting of the Anheuser-Busch Brewery. In the middle is a postcard produced by Anheuser-Busch. And on the farthest right, we have the same image, perhaps taken from the postcard, but I'm not sure, that was reproduced in the WPA Guide to Missouri, which was published in the early 40s. Here we have that famous image of Lover's Leap in Hannibal. On the bottom, we have another postcard. And on the right, we have an image of Lover's Leap that appeared in Fortune magazine in 1945 when Truman assumed the presidency. And finally, we have the famous fountain outside Union Station. We have the painting of it, the photograph, and then we also have an FSA OWI photograph of the fountain taken by Vashon, and he does a whole series by the fountains. So what we're seeing is that, in fact, the images of Missouri that we're seeing are not necessarily local. I mean, they are, but they're also those images of local Missouri that have been picked up by national media and are part of the national conversation surrounding Missouri. And the third observation this group made is that because we're dealing with a group of paintings done in 48 after the war, we're dealing with a real moment of transition from kind of the celebration of folkways that we saw in the Great Depression, that we saw during the Depression, to a kind of celebration of industrial might, from kind of a romantic notion of the farmer to a celebration of technology. And so all of these paintings seem to be in some ways about this transitioning culture and what's going to emerge from it. Now, as a result, this group created what we called a site map. And this was this was predicated on the contents of the art at the time. And we tried to come up with something that would cover everything. And as you can see, they've tried to focus on the collection itself, the introduction, the patron, the artist, the controversy. They wanted to say, what were the perceptions of Missouri? What did people know about? We wanted to look at the arts in Missouri. What were the national trends? What were the regional trends? How are people learning about art? How about the people of Missouri? Who's represented in these images and what did they bring to the culture? Also, Missourians at work and social life. These were the big kind of areas that were covered by the paintings. The students also created a template for what they believed would be the optimum website. And they borrowed from two different sites that they particularly liked. And for many of you, it probably won't surprise you that one of those sites was a historic house museum, and the other was a library oral history project site. So between those two in particular, what they loved and what they were looking for in developing a site was one sort of a model that made a design that made it virtually natural, that made it natural to use. That there were so many that actually became so complicated you couldn't find information. So the goal was to create a design that was very user-friendly and that was easy to navigate. The second thing is they wanted to take advantage of the ability to showcase primary sources along with paintings, to include oral histories. So for example, the interviews were done with all the artists in the 70s. Or I think it was in the 70s. Why not put those online so people can hear the artists remembering when they made when they made the paintings. But why don't we take advantage of the oral histories that we have, take advantage of the primary source material and really make this come alive? So those were sort of the two main goals. And during this time, I actually found myself asking a very different question. Not very different, but a related question, which was, can a visual medium teach visual literacy? You know, at the time, there was a big movement at Missouri, at the university, to think about the digital humanities, and I was part of those groups. But I was increasingly frustrated by so many of the projects. One, because so many of them were simply, I felt, replicating what had been done in book or print formats. And that's not a surprise. Scholars of new media have long said that when a new medium emerges, it takes a while for it to find its place. But I still kept feeling like it remained, that so many of the digital humanities projects that were being supported were still heavily text-based, and they weren't taking advantage of this medium, which was so much more flexible. The other thing I struggled with is that people seemed to forget that text is not transparent, that it doesn't mean the same thing wherever it's printed, that text is a representation itself, and that when placed in the context, its meaning changes if it's in a print book or online. And yet many people weren't considering that change in context might change the meaning of the text. So there was this notion of text as somehow transparent that really bothered me. As an art historian who knew that, I know that I read differently depending on the font choice, for example. So that concept that Michael Buckland put forth almost 30 years ago now, that information as thing, that's what I was missing. Like, how do we recognize that all this text, all these images are things, and that the ways in which they interact are going to tell a story? And that's actually the third thing these students learned or found out, is that they really liked the sites that used the visual culture of the era and the music of the era in its design, so that the design of the web site itself became part of its meaning, part of the interpretation, or part of the framework in which we wanted to invite users to participate. The goals of the site changed a little bit, sort of as the second and the third classes began to work, because rather than looking at the site as a whole, we had already done that. The students were able to take advantage of their colleagues' work and instead begin to work on individual paintings. And as we looked at these individual paintings, it became quite clear that they were telling these really complicated stories about the dynamics of life in Missouri that didn't necessarily appear right away, but they appeared as the stories were told. And the more we did research, the more we contextualized the paintings, the more we realized that they were showing tremendous amounts of conflict or challenges to traditional assumptions. And not surprisingly, what we found out is that the values espoused in the paintings were predicated or naturalized the views of ideal Scruggs Vanderbilt Barney patrons. I'm showing you here an advertisement where you have the woman in a very, in her jacket, looking at a work of art in the background. Here we see a shop window, and here we see a tea room. This is the tea room that emerged, I think, in the late 40s. And so the the point of view of the collection was not repertorial, or it wasn't documentary, that in fact, it very much was about a white middle class, rising elite class, primarily white, living in the suburbs, although moving from the city, causing a problem for Scruggs itself. But it was really the values of that community that were embedded in these paintings. So the question became, how do we show that? How do you show kind of the ideals and the values that are so entrenched that they don't have to be pictured? And I want to give you two examples. And again, this is based on student research. Here is a great painting of a basket maker, and it actually shows 3 different moments in the basket making process. You can see he's cultivating the materials, he's weaving the basket, and here are some examples of the work. And it's taken place in a rural location, and it appears as if he's making these baskets probably for use. And they would have been made for utilitarian reasons earlier in the 19th century, maybe even in the early decades of the 20th. But in the 1930s and 40s, they were generally made for sale to tourists who were traveling around down Route 66. And this is the Myers family, who are particularly well known for their baskets. And so this was now a folk culture that had become kind of a tourist part of the tourist industry, part of the tourist trade. And importantly, it also became at this point part of what were called folk traditions. And those very traditions were faced by other Missourians as particularly problematic. So in this same period in Springfield, they were planning a folklore festival, and this caused a lot of consternation. And in fact, initially the Chamber of Commerce decided to not hold the festival, and then later, under pressure, decided to hold it. But they were very concerned because they didn't want to promote Southern Missouri as hillbilly folk country. The question becoming, and I'm reading you part of this newspaper article here, the Chamber of Commerce here voiced a warning against over-featuring the hillbilly element in Ozarks life. Was that warning well taken? Will visitors viewing the Ozarks demonstrations get a false and unfavorable impression of the Ozarks? Is the featuring of folk material bad publicity? And there was at least one person who said, listen, we've been working our whole lives to get rid of this perception of us. So why would we invite it now? Now, ultimately, people did celebrate that Ozark Folk Festival, but the controversy over it really did spark kind of a larger question about these increasingly kind of marginalized rural areas that were actually maintaining these folk traditions, but for very modern audiences, and people who are trying to promote Missouri as progressive, industrializing, and mechanized. So we have a simple painting of a basket maker capable of creating real tension. And secondly, I'm going to go through this quickly. Here's a photo. This is a painting, excuse me, of the Golden Eagle, which by this time had already outlasted its prime. So it really becomes a representation of African Americans looking at the past and being kind of located there. And I realize I'm running out of time here, but this was in this image, what we see is either the removal of African Americans from modern life or their invisibility. Here, and so these students really began to think we need to do something else. So they created a new kind of object homepage, which would show the painting and a short caption, as well as the potential to read more. Then they would want to click on it and go to the painting, which would also have in this area a 3 to 4 paragraph discussion of the painting and its primary context. And then each context would have its own painting, which would describe the context and showcase the primary sources. And here became one enterprising student began to use this. And you can see that here she uses the basket maker in the Ozarks. And then investigate more. And then the next page includes the longer description and again, the investigate more. So students were really trying to provide, to make their interpretations of the painting transparent, but also to show how in comparison, these paintings were actually quite nostalgic and quite coded in terms of race, racial beliefs, gender expectations. There's actually very few pictures of women here unless they're shopping. And so what I want to end with is just the ideas that developed, because I think I'm going a little bit over the final 3 minutes, and what I kind of got excited about. That one idea the students had was to create a map, which would include all of the paintings so that people could actually, an interactive map that could take them to those locations. We also realized as we were creating content that there was so much content out there that had already been produced by so many different groups, including the Folklife Project. All the information we were getting was coming from the State Historical Society. And some of the students who were getting really interested in this work were going to their local historical societies, and by asking basic questions, we're getting insights into their painting they never would have gotten. So part of the goal for this project, I think, is to take advantage of all the material out there. This is a great Missouri map, which shows you all sorts of pictures of it. And in the back, it uses the scrapbook format to suggest how you can take a vacation to Missouri. But the goal of the site would, one, to have graduate students perhaps go to different local historical societies, find materials, find those stories, bring them back and add them to the website. So multiple voices are at play in each page. You not only have perhaps one student point of view, but maybe you have 3. In addition, viewers themselves can begin to compare the photograph of a place and the painting. And that way you can see that all of the farms that are pictured in this collection had already become industrialized, so that we're not looking at a transparent vision, but rather a very constructed image. And moreover, we can see already in these paintings the way that African American labor and African American life gets eclipsed in these pictures. They're for the most part not included, and when they are, it's quite stereotypical. And I'll repeat what I just said. In terms of gender, it is also problematic because it pretty much ignores working women right after the war, when many were either still wanting to work or trying to work. So this, I think, poses this possibility to be a site that can be an archive and a museum and a library, that can also create an opportunity for larger communities to come together and share their histories. And since we know that there are many people around the state who still see they still see these paintings and can tell you where it is and who it's of, the opportunity to have those stories and to bring them together to kind of reflect on Missouri history and to see how meanings have changed over time. This collection really provides a remarkable opportunity to do that. So I guess I'd be interested now in hearing if anyone has any ideas or enthusiasm or suggestions or questions about either the collection or the hoped for project, which has faced some uphill battles already. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Kristen. That was a fantastic presentation. I really appreciated the kind of broad overview of some of Missouri's history through these paintings. These are pretty spectacular. We do have one question in the chat right now. So Sarah Buchanan is introducing herself. She is someone who teaches archives at the University of Missouri. And she's interested in learning a little bit more about digital humanities. And so she asks, picking up on the place of text in digital humanities work, where could students be contributing in positive ways?
That's a great question. And Sarah would be someone who we would need as part of the project, obviously. I think part of the issue is highlighting, I was finding that my students, once they started looking at websites and engaging them, really found quickly what worked and what didn't. And many of them recognized or were playing with during this time, for example, what kind of font to use or and all the students, by the way, had to do their own independent projects. So they would work on a painting and then they'd have to do something else that interested them. And, one person designed the page and designed sort of an icon for it and really sought to use colors from the 40s, images from the 40s. Now, all of that became problematic, of course, when I was looking to put this online because the university has its own code of aesthetics code. And so suddenly a lot of the ways in which the students had tried to create a site that was visually, that worked visually with the images and even the primary source material, a lot of that was pushed by the wayside, I guess is what I would say. We also had a lot of trouble, to answer your question, Sarah. This was originally part of the Digital Humanities Center, but the people who are doing that I think they were trying so hard to put it into a website format and there wasn't an appropriate one. A lot of visual, and many of you know this far better than I do, but many sort of museum sites or gallery sites are predicated on commercial, on sites for commerce, because they have the visual is so central to those. But to use a site for commerce for this didn't allow that extended, the depth or the interaction. So part of what the students found, I think most of all, was that they were just doing, in some ways, the archival work, and they were finding stuff. They were finding the comparisons, they were finding all sorts of materials. They were finding recipes. A young woman who did she did the hog farming in Nixa, and she was finding, a recipe book that people were sharing and putting up that recipe book. It's a text, right? But it's also done it's from the era. And so by showing a picture of that text as opposed to kind of typing it in, we're maintaining a sense of that historical authenticity. So I think I've come around to perhaps answer answer the question, and it took me a while to get there. I think it's often by showing the text in its original state, in its archival state, that it can be more contextualized. For example, showing the historical image, or taking a photograph of it and not trying to clean this up, letting it be yellowed at the sides, highlights its age, and that in turn is going to shape the way it's read. I'm not sure that's quite, Sarah, you can, if I didn't answer that correctly, let me know. I think the other thing you might be asking is, yes, I think questions of, the other thing I think it's important for these students to work with is that metadata. So one of the issues we faced was, okay, if we make this into something more focused on the paintings and these object pages, this is going, what categories are we going to use to organize them? Are we going to use the artist, for example? Are we going to use the name of the painting? And if we can only use 3 kind of ways to look or ways to search, what are we going to use? And to me, having students work through those questions is just as important, because all databases are different and they need to learn to navigate those. So it's a great question.
Yeah, she says thank you. So I think you answered that. And
Okay.
I know I was going to mention too, I've been involved in some digital humanities projects here at Truman, and it is often very challenging to try to teach students both the technology aspect to create the website, as well as the historical context and the information that's actually being presented. And I know that there's been a lot of challenges, especially if you've got limited time, say a semester long class, that you're trying to introduce all of these concepts. Did you find that to be an issue for you as well, or do you guys have some sort of preliminary educational endeavors that sort of prep a student to do that?
No, this has been, because I'm from an, I teach art history and material culture. So in many ways, I've done more content and I've been looking for help for the format. So many of the students, what we were able to do, we were working with people outside. So we were working with the web designer in the first class, enough that we could begin to think about those technological questions, but never enough to actualize it. And I actually worked with another website designer. Everyone said, oh, you need a website, you need someone who can design and code. But finding that kind of person is much different. And I tried working with the computer. So they all said, go to computer science. I did that, but he just wanted to put in the website, right? And he didn't have any background in web design or art history. So it was difficult to create that realm of communication. So I think you're exactly right. I think the hardest thing about the digital humanities is actually creating those conversations. And so I always presented, what was that?
I think it's an opportunity.
It is, and all the students knew, it's like, I just keep track of their names and I have the work they like, so I'm creating an archive of the work they've done. And so if it can finally come together, they'll get credit for it. But I've always told them that it's a project that's bigger than the class.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
And then showing them what other students have done, I think gives them a sense of what they can contribute. And it's pretty remarkable.
Sounds like a great endeavor. I don't know if you're following the chat, Kristen, but I wanted to point out somebody, Sarah, has mentioned, if it hasn't already happened, this project could connect with the craft workshop at the NPS Ozark Riverways, where they work to keep craft ways alive.
Oh, perfect.
Just to mention that collaboration. And we'll there's one question in the chat or in the Q&A feature that I'll ask here, and then we'll wrap it up for today. So Sarah O'Rell from Truman State University asks, is the University of Missouri Art Museum continuing to add images or paintings of the state as part of their collecting strategy? And if so, is this contemporary work or historical work?
That's a great question. And First of all of these paintings, it's pretty amazing. The only reproductions of these paintings we had for a long time, actually until this collection was moved to the museum, the only reproductions of these images were from that 1948 catalog. So when I first started presenting on this, I was using reproductions that were 7 times removed. The museum, when it brought the collection into, when the collection was moved, they took high quality, museum quality photographs of all of the objects. And those are actually available online. So you can go to the museum site, the Museum of Art and Archaeology website, put in Scruggs, Vanderbilt, Barney, and all of them will come. There are, and I would say part of the goal of moving this to the museum was to make the museum, give it a center for regional modernism, a place to go. So there have been, since this started, there have been some purchases that relate to it. And also there are a lot of locals who have similar paintings and who I think, we're going to who might hopefully donate if we could find a place. I think that's why, and because there are some of the, I would say this, some members of the board of directors for the museum have extraordinary collections of mid-century modernism. Now, as to the more contemporary works, I think because of space, the museum, and actually Kathy Calloway is here, she might be able to put this differently. But I think they've been, I would say, yes, it's become part of their collecting priorities. I think these are historical works, but but when we put this, the other hope for this collection is that we have pictures of the Year International at the journalism school. There are a lot of collections that could easily be integrated into it. I'm struggling, and Kathy, you might be able to say something better. I'm struggling because, the museum has suffered, it was moved, and I'm not sure it's been able to do all the things it's wanted to do. But this is a place where this is the only collection of this kind left in the United States altogether. So there were other collections, they've all been disbanded or lost. So this is kind of a remarkable holding that can tell us so much, and it would be lovely if we could find a way to celebrate it, and in doing so, also celebrate, local archives. One of the students was from Joplin, and she did all their mining pictures from Joplin. And she just, we all kept wondering why the mines? They had already, they closed after the war. And she just started talking to the, and if he's here, thank you. He told her, listen, you couldn't go anywhere in the city without seeing those mines. Like if an artist came in, that's exactly where you'd go. So that suddenly changed things, right? And it was when somebody realized, oh, why were they still curing meat? They had refrigerated trucks, right? And then it was like, but they weren't on the truck, but they weren't on the right line, so they never would have been able to receive it in time. There are all sorts of these kind of realities that people are going to know and can share. And yeah, I'm looking at the chat, and yeah, I find these works amazing. Some of these artists are understudied. I showed them to my graduate advisor, who just couldn't believe it was all here. So yes, I would. And I'm so excited to to see how this, oh, good. And Kathy put where you can find the paintings in the collection. So,
Well, Kristen, I'd like to thank you for your wonderful presentation today. I think it sounds like we may need to do another one just on digital humanities and have you kind of explore this a little bit further. But I think we're out of time for today, so we'll go ahead and wrap up. And so I'd like to thank Kristen and I'd like to thank all of our attendees. And I'd like to also invite Sarah Wilson, our current president of the Missouri Association for Museums and Archives Board, to say a few concluding remarks.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Amanda. Can we stop Kristen's screen share? I don't know if I have that
are
ability
you
on.
sure you don't want to see Lovers Leap the rest of the?
I do. It's a really fun project, and thank you so much for sharing it. I'm just going to jump in here and close the conference. So I've introduced myself several times this week, but I'll do it one last time. My name is Sarah Wilson. I'm the current president of the Missouri Association of Museums and Archives, as well as the executive director of the St. Joseph Museums. I started my journey with MAMA several years ago as the Northwest Missouri rep, and served in that capacity before I moved into the role of the vice president, which I had the pleasure of serving under Candace Saul for several years and helping her organize conferences. I know what a big job that is. Amanda, thank you so much, and your conference planning committee for making this happen. Also would like to thank Linda Endersby, because she's been instrumental in the back end side of setting up the Zoom conference. I moved a couple of years ago into the presidency, and I have to say the Missouri Association of Museums and Archives Board is just absolutely fantastic. They are a wonderful group of individuals, and I'm so proud to have served with them. And I'm looking forward to stepping into the role of past president for the association. So very much looking forward to that. So our conference has been quite successful for a virtual conference. We have had 95 attendees register, and we didn't know what to expect, so I'm happy with that number. I'd like to thank all of our attendees and the Missouri Humanities Council for supporting us. And also, I just want to take a moment and thank you for the work that you do daily across the state of Missouri, because it's been amazing to hear about all of the tremendous things that everybody's been doing. And I'm so proud of the museum and archives work across the state. Our goal with MAMA is to educate, connect, and advocate for our museums and archives. And I think we've done that especially well through the pandemic. Being able to bring virtual programming has actually been a blessing for our organization. We've been able to connect people in new ways that we probably hadn't thought of before the pandemic. So it's been a silver lining. We've been able to provide over 25 digital programs to our members, as well as non-members. I would encourage you, if you are a non-member, to take out a membership in MAMA. It's important, it helps support our organization, and it'll really keep you connected. A couple of other things I'd like to promote. We do have Museum Advocacy Day coming up, and that will be virtual this year, sponsored through the American Alliance of Museums. And the cost to attend Advocacy Day this year is only $25. We'd like to have as many people as possible present and able to participate. So I would encourage you, we'll be sending out information to both consider membership as well as consider representing your organization at Museum Advocacy Day. And then last but not least, I would like to thank Jamie Henry, who has served on our board as our Central Missouri rep for quite a few years. He's done an amazing and remarkable job. He'll be stepping off the board, but still be helping MAMA out in many ways, serving on our conference committee as we move forward with planning a conference in St. Charles, hopefully next year. And then Doran Cart, who is also going to be stepping off the board. We have a new slate of candidates on the board. And so at this time, I would like to welcome Amanda Langendorfer, who will be stepping in as president. Amanda, did you want to say a couple of words?
Thank you, Sarah. I'm very excited to becoming the new president for MAMA. This has been a great organization. I followed a path very similar to Sarah's, and the fact that I served as the Northeast Missouri rep for quite some time, 2 years, and then stepped into the role of vice president. And excited to follow in Sarah's footsteps and continue some of the great work that the Missouri Associations for Museums and Archives is doing across the state. So thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. Amanda's vice president will be Chris Gordon from the Missouri Historical Society. We are also welcoming a new Kansas City area representative, Tara Laver, and then welcoming back Mary McIntosh, Steve Hoffman, Lindsay Young, Amber Napoleon, and Maggie Mahan to our board. And so again, it's a wonderful board for the Missouri Association of Museums and Archives. I'm so grateful for all that they do, and also grateful for all of our members that they've done. One last thing I would like to add is we do have one diversity internship available for this year. We've already done 3. We have 2 currently in the field and have completed 1. So if you know of a student that or an organization that would like to have a diversity internship, we do have one of those available. So without anything else, I would just like to say thank you all. It's been a pleasure serving with you, and I look forward to moving into the role of past president and seeing what Amanda does with the organization moving forward.
Thank you very much. And I hope everybody has a great rest of your afternoon, and we'll conclude the conference. Thank you so much.